9 times. That is how many times Senator Ron Johnson interrupted Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett during a joint oversight hearing on January 14, 2025. 9 separate interruptions across 47 minutes of testimony. The cameras caught every single one. The C-SPAN transcript documented each disruption with timestamps. And by the time the hearing concluded, Johnson would sit in complete silence for 23 seconds while millions watched on live television, unable to answer the simplest question a United States senator could be asked: "Did you read the report?" But that moment of devastating silence was still 90 minutes away when Johnson entered the hearing room that Tuesday morning. He arrived with the confidence of a man who had done this before, who knew the rhythms of televised hearings, who understood that a well-timed interruption could derail an entire line of questioning before it ever landed. He had 16 years of Senate experience. He chaired committees. He appeared on Sunday morning news programs. And the woman sitting across from him, this freshman representative from Texas, had been in Congress for barely 2 years. Johnson settled into his chair with the ease of someone who owned the space. His opening statement ran 11 minutes over the allotted time, and when the committee chair gently suggested he wrap up, Johnson smiled and said he would finish when he was finished. The room understood the message. This was his hearing. Everyone else was just visiting. When Crockett's turn came to question the witness, a Department of Veterans Affairs regional director named Marcus Webb, who had been summoned to explain a backlog of 47,000 pending disability claims, Johnson leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. His expression suggested he was already bored. Crockett had requested this witness personally. She had submitted 14 pages of preliminary questions to the committee staff. She had spent 6 weeks preparing for this exact moment. Johnson had not read a single page of her submission. Crockett began by asking Webb about the average processing time for disability claims in his region. Before Webb could answer, Johnson interrupted. The first interruption. He suggested that processing times were a state-level issue, not federal, and that perhaps the Congresswoman was confused about jurisdictional boundaries. Crockett waited for him to finish, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her expression perfectly neutral. She thanked the senator for his input and repeated her question to Webb. Webb began to answer. Johnson interrupted again. The second interruption. He wanted to know if the Congresswoman had any evidence that processing times were actually a problem, or if she was simply repeating complaints she had heard from constituents who did not understand how the system worked. Something in the room shifted. The press gallery, which had been half empty when the hearing began, started filling up. Reporters who had been covering other sessions began filtering in. They could sense what was happening. Johnson was not simply interrupting. He was performing a very specific kind of dismissal, the kind that treats a colleague not as an equal but as a student who needs correction. And Crockett was letting him do it. She was not objecting. She was not calling points of order. She was simply waiting. The third interruption came 4 minutes later. The fourth came 90 seconds after that. By the fifth interruption, Johnson was not even pretending to have substantive objections. He was interrupting to interrupt, asserting dominance through disruption, reminding everyone in the room who had seniority and who did not. Crockett's face remained perfectly composed. She took notes during each interruption. She thanked Johnson each time he finished speaking. She returned to her questions as if nothing had happened. The sixth interruption occurred when Crockett asked Webb about a specific veteran, a Marine Corps sergeant named Daniel Mora, who had filed his disability claim in April 2022 and was still waiting for a decision in January 2025. Johnson cut her off before she finished reading Mora's name. He suggested that individual cases were not appropriate for oversight hearings, that the Congresswoman should handle constituent services through proper channels, and that using committee time for anecdotes was a waste of everyone's time. Crockett waited. She thanked him again. She asked the question again. Webb began to answer. Johnson interrupted. The seventh interruption. He wanted to make sure the record reflected that he believed this line of questioning was inappropriate. By now, the hearing room was completely full. The back wall was lined with staffers who had heard what was happening and come to watch. The press gallery was standing room only. Twitter was exploding. Clips of the interruptions were already going viral. And Crockett was still taking notes. Still waiting, still thanking Johnson every single time he interrupted her. The eighth interruption came when Crockett began to ask about the total number of veterans affected by the backlog. Johnson objected that the Congresswoman was assuming a backlog existed without having proven it first. The ninth and final interruption occurred 37 minutes into the hearing when Crockett asked Webb if the department had received any guidance from Congress on how to address the processing delays. Johnson cut her off mid-sentence and said he would like to remind everyone that Congress had already appropriated substantial funding for veteran services and that if the Congresswoman had bothered to read the appropriations bill, she would know that. Crockett set down her pen. She looked at Johnson for the first time since the hearing had begun. Her voice when she spoke was quieter than it had been all morning. She said she appreciated the senator's passion for veterans' issues. She said she was certain that passion came from a place of genuine concern. And then she said she had a few questions for the senator himself if he would be willing to answer them. Johnson smiled. He said he would be happy to educate the Congresswoman on how appropriations worked. Crockett reached beneath the table and lifted a blue binder onto the desk in front of her. It was thick, easily 4 inches of paper, with colored tabs visible along the edge. She opened it with the care of someone handling evidence at a trial. The first page was a Department of Veterans Affairs Inspector General report dated November 2024. She asked Johnson if he had read it. Johnson said he was familiar with the major findings. Crockett asked him to be specific. She asked if he could name the 3 primary causes of the disability claims backlog identified on page 18 of the report. Johnson's smile tightened slightly. He said he did not have the report memorized, but that he was confident the issues were being addressed. Crockett thanked him and turned to the second tab in her binder. It was a transcript of a Senate Veterans Affairs Committee hearing from March 2024. She asked Johnson if he had attended that hearing. Johnson said he had. Crockett asked if he remembered the testimony of VA Secretary Dennis McDonough regarding staffing shortages in regional offices. Johnson said he remembered the general outline. Crockett turned to the third tab. It was a budget document. She asked Johnson if he could explain why the Senate version of the 2024 Veterans Affairs Appropriations Bill had included $38 million for new claims processors, and the final version signed into law had included 0. Johnson said that budget negotiations were complex and involved many priorities. Crockett asked who had proposed cutting the funding for claims processors. Johnson said he would have to check the record. Crockett already had the record. She turned to the fourth tab. It was a memo from Johnson's own office to the Senate Appropriations Committee, dated July 2023, recommending the elimination of what it called redundant processing positions and the reallocation of those funds to IT infrastructure. The memo was signed by Johnson's chief of staff. Crockett asked if Johnson was aware that his own staff had lobbied to cut the exact funding that would have addressed the backlog he was now claiming did not exist. The room was completely silent. Johnson's face had gone from confident to neutral to something harder to read. He said his staff made recommendations and that he reviewed them in the context of overall budget priorities. Crockett asked if he had reviewed the Inspector General report before making that recommendation. Johnson said he trusted his staff to do due diligence. Crockett asked again if he had personally read the IG report. Johnson said he had been briefed on it. Crockett turned to the fifth tab. It was a series of emails obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request. The emails were between Johnson's senior policy advisor and a veterans advocacy organization called the American Veterans Coalition. In the emails, Johnson's advisor explicitly stated that the senator believed disability claims processing could be streamlined through automation and that hiring additional human processors was a waste of taxpayer money. The emails were dated 2 months after the IG report had been published, the same report that explicitly warned that automation without human oversight was causing a significant percentage of erroneous denials. Crockett asked Johnson if he stood by his staff's assessment that human claims processors were a waste of money. Johnson said the emails were being taken out of context. Crockett asked what context would make that statement acceptable. Johnson said that he supported veterans and that his record spoke for itself. Crockett turned to the sixth tab. It was Johnson's voting record on veterans' issues over the past 4 years. She read the list aloud. He had voted against the PACT Act, which expanded health care for veterans exposed to toxic burn pits. He had voted against increasing funding for VA mental health services. He had voted against extending the deadline for disability claims appeals. He had voted against funding for homeless veterans' housing. He had voted for budget resolutions that cut VA staffing by 12%. Every single vote was documented with bill numbers and dates. Crockett did not editorialize. She simply read the record. Johnson's hands were gripping the edge of the table now. He said voting records did not tell the full story, that many of those bills had contained unrelated provisions he could not support, that fiscal responsibility required difficult choices. Crockett asked if fiscal responsibility also required ignoring a backlog of 47,000 veterans waiting for the benefits they had earned. Johnson said he had never ignored anything. Crockett reached beneath the table again and lifted a second binder onto the desk. This one was red. She opened it to a tab marked Constituent Correspondence. Inside were copies of letters, dozens of them, sent to Johnson's office from Wisconsin veterans describing their experiences with the disability claims process. The letters dated back 3 years. Many were handwritten. All of them described months or years of waiting. Several described financial hardship while waiting for decisions. A few described family crises caused by the delays. Every single letter had been sent to Johnson's Senate office. Every single letter had received a form response thanking the veteran for their service and assuring them that Senator Johnson took veterans' issues very seriously. Crockett asked Johnson if he remembered reading any of these letters personally. Johnson said his office received thousands of letters and that he could not personally read every piece of correspondence. Crockett asked if his office had ever forwarded any of these complaints to the Veterans Affairs Committee for investigation. Johnson said he would have to check with his staff. Crockett turned to another tab. It was an internal email from Johnson's Constituent Services Director to his Legislative Director. The email explicitly stated that veterans' disability complaints should be handled with form letters and that the senator did not want to be briefed on individual cases unless they became media issues. The silence in the room was total now. Even the reporters had stopped typing. Johnson was staring at the email projected on the screen behind Crockett. His face had gone red. He said he had no recollection of that directive and that if it existed, it did not reflect his personal views. Crockett asked whose views it did reflect, if not his own. Johnson said he could not speak to internal office communications from years ago. Crockett closed the red binder and opened a third folder, this one manila and much thinner. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a man in his early 50s standing in front of an American flag. His face was gaunt. He was holding a sign that read, Day 987 waiting for my claim. Crockett identified him as Daniel Mora, the veteran she had mentioned at the beginning of her questioning, the Marine sergeant whose name Johnson had interrupted her from finishing. Mora had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He had been medically discharged in 2021 with a traumatic brain injury and chronic pain from shrapnel wounds. He had filed his disability claim 14 days after his discharge. He was still waiting. Crockett turned to the next page. It was a financial statement showing Mora's bank account balance on January 1st, 2025. The balance was $174. Mora had been surviving on part-time work he could barely perform because of his injuries and on loans from family members who were themselves struggling. He had applied for temporary assistance while waiting for his claim to be processed. His application had been denied because technically he had income from his part-time job, $890 a month, which was $32 below the federal poverty line for a single adult, but $70 above the threshold for assistance. Crockett said that Mora had written to Johnson's office 4 times. She had copies of all 4 letters. She asked if Johnson would like her to read them aloud. Johnson said that would not be necessary. Crockett said she thought it might be necessary because the senator had suggested earlier that individual cases were not appropriate for oversight hearings, and she wanted to make sure he understood exactly what the backlog looked like when it had a name and a face and a bank account with $174 in it. Johnson said he had tremendous respect for Sergeant Mora's service. Crockett asked if that respect had translated into any action on his behalf. Johnson said his office would look into the case immediately. Crockett said Mora's case had been sent to Johnson's office 9 months ago by a Wisconsin Veterans Service Organization and that the office had never responded. Johnson said there must have been a miscommunication. Crockett turned to the final page in the manila folder. It was a medical report dated December 2024. Daniel Mora had been hospitalized for a suicide attempt. The report listed chronic pain, financial stress, and feeling abandoned by the government he had served as contributing factors. Mora had survived. He was currently living with his sister in Milwaukee. His disability claim was still pending. The hearing room was absolutely silent. Johnson's face had gone from red to pale. His hands were flat on the table. Crockett looked at him with an expression that was not angry, not triumphant, not emotional at all. It was the expression of someone presenting evidence at a trial, waiting for the defendant to respond. She asked Johnson a simple question. She asked if he had read the Inspector General report on disability claims processing before recommending cuts to claims processor funding. It was a yes or no question. Johnson opened his mouth. Nothing came. He closed it again. His eyes moved to his staff seated behind him, but they were looking down at their notes, unable to help. He looked back at Crockett. 10 seconds passed. 15. 20. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the quiet click of camera shutters. 23 seconds. Finally, Johnson's voice came, quieter than it had been all morning. He said he had been briefed on the findings. Crockett asked again if he had read the report personally. Johnson said he trusted his staff to provide accurate summaries. Crockett said nothing for a moment. Then she said that trusting staff was reasonable, but that cutting funding that would save veterans' lives required more than a summary. She said that interrupting a colleague 9 times to avoid hearing about the consequences of those cuts was not leadership. She said that sending form letters to suffering veterans while lobbying to eliminate the jobs that would help them was not fiscal responsibility. It was abandonment. Johnson attempted to respond. He said he had always fought for veterans. Crockett turned to the voting record still visible on the screen behind her. She said the record spoke clearly and that it said something very different from what the senator was claiming. Johnson said votes were complicated. Crockett said Sergeant Moore's situation was not complicated. He served his country. He was injured. He filed for the benefits he had earned. And he waited for almost 3 years while the senator who claimed to support him voted against every measure that would have helped him and cut the funding that would have processed his claim. Johnson's voice rose. He said he resented the implication that he did not care about veterans. Crockett's voice did not rise. She said she was not implying anything. She was reading his voting record, his staff emails, his budget recommendations, and his office's response to veterans in crisis. She said if those facts led to uncomfortable implications, that was not her responsibility. It was his. Johnson stood up. For a moment, it looked like he might walk out. His chief of staff put a hand on his arm. Johnson sat back down, his face rigid. The committee chair asked if the senator had further questions for the witness. Johnson said he did not. The chair asked if he had any response to the congresswoman's questions. Johnson said he would submit a written statement for the record. Crockett thanked the senator for his time. She turned back to Marcus Webb, the VA regional director who had been sitting silently through the entire exchange, and asked him one final question. She asked if the department would commit to prioritizing Sergeant Moore's claim for immediate review. Webb said yes without hesitation. Crockett asked if he would provide a status update to her office within 72 hours. Webb said yes again. Crockett thanked him and yielded her remaining time. The hearing continued for another 30 minutes, but no one was paying attention to the other questions. The reporters were already filing their stories. The clips were already viral. The 23 seconds of silence had been isolated and shared across every platform. But the longer clip, the full 12-minute exchange, was what people watched in its entirety. They watched Johnson's confidence dissolve. They watched his face change as each piece of evidence landed. They watched him unable to answer the simplest question a senator could be asked. Within 48 hours, Johnson's office issued a statement saying the senator deeply regretted any administrative oversights and that his staff would undergo additional training on veterans issues. Within a week, 3 major Wisconsin veterans organizations called for Johnson to resign from the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. Within 2 weeks, the Senate Majority Leader quietly removed him from the committee and reassigned him to a subcommittee on Postal Service oversight. And within 30 days, Daniel Mora received a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs informing him that his disability claim had been approved with full retroactive benefits dating to his original filing. The total payment was $127,000. Mora used part of it to pay back his family. He used part of it to get his own apartment. And he used part of it to make a donation to a veterans advocacy organization in Texas that had been founded the previous year by a group of veterans who had watched a freshman congresswoman from Dallas take apart a Senate committee chairman on live television and decided that maybe someone was finally fighting for them. Crockett never mentioned the hearing again publicly. She did not do victory laps on cable news. She did not write op-eds about accountability. She simply went back to work. But at the start of every subsequent hearing where she had questioning time, she brought the same blue binder, the same red binder, and a new manila folder with a new name inside. And every single member of every committee she sat on knew exactly what those binders meant. Because the thing about interrupting someone 9 times is that you have to be absolutely certain they do not have 9 pieces of evidence waiting for you. Ron Johnson had been certain. He had been wrong. And by the time he understood his mistake, 23 seconds of silence had already told the entire country everything they needed to know about which one of them had actually done their homework. This was not about partisan politics. This was not about personality conflicts. This was about a very simple principle that apparently needed to be demonstrated on live television. If you are going to dismiss someone, if you are going to interrupt them, if you are going to treat them like they do not belong in the room, you had better make absolutely certain they did not spend 6 weeks preparing for exactly that moment. Because when the interruptions stop and the binders open and the evidence starts coming, all the seniority in the world will not save you from 23 seconds of silence that the entire country watches you sit through. Jasmine Crockett had been interrupted 9 times. She had waited through every single one. And when her turn finally came, she made every second count.